The Geneva Accords that ended the war at Dien Bien Phu divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, a temporary administrative division intended to be resolved by national elections within 2 years. The elections never occurred. The temporary division became permanent. The permanent division produced the political conditions for American military involvement that would eventually commit over 500,000 American troops, kill approximately 58,000 Americans, and an estimated 1 to 3 million Vietnamese. The line drawn after Dien Bien Phu is the direct cause of the war that defined a generation of American politics. This episode traces the battle that produced that line. French colonial rule in Indochina, established progressively from the 1850s through the 1890s, had governed Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia for approximately 7 decades by 1954. The Viet Minh, the Vietnamese independence movement, led by Ho Chi Minh and militarily commanded by General Vo Nguyen Giap, had been fighting French colonial forces since 1946. Following Japan's wartime occupation and France's attempt to reassert colonial control after World War II, by 1953, the war had reached a stalemate that French political and military leadership found increasingly unsustainable, both in casualties and in domestic French political support. French military planners conceived Dien Bien Phu as the decisive battle that would break the stalemate in France's favor. General Christian de Castries established the fortified position at Dien Bien Phu in November 1953 with a specific strategic theory. The remote valley, surrounded by hills the French believed inaccessible to heavy artillery, would force the Viet Minh into a conventional set-piece battle. The French theory, a well-defended fixed position, would draw Viet Minh forces into attacking fortified positions, where superior French firepower, artillery, and air support would inflict catastrophic and decisive casualties on Giap's forces. The position included an airstrip for resupply and reinforcement, multiple strongpoints with French names: Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Huguette, Dominique, Eliane, Claudine, Isabelle, and an eventual garrison of approximately 15,000 French Union troops, including French regulars, Foreign Legion units, and colonial troops from Vietnam, Algeria, and Morocco. The specific French intelligence assessment that the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu were inaccessible to heavy artillery was based on a reasonable evaluation of the terrain's difficulty: dense jungle, steep slopes, no roads suitable for vehicle transport of artillery pieces weighing several tons. The assessment was correct about the terrain's difficulty for conventional artillery transport. It was wrong about Giap's capacity to overcome that difficulty through alternative means. The specific French assumption that artillery requires roads and motorized transport reflected a conventional European military framework that did not anticipate the specific logistics innovation that the Viet Minh would deploy, disassembling guns into component parts and moving them by hand, bicycle, and human portage through terrain that no army had previously moved heavy artillery across. General Vo Nguyen Giap's logistics solution to the Dien Bien Phu campaign is among the most extraordinary military engineering achievements of the 20th century. Artillery pieces, including American-made howitzers captured from the French and Chinese-supplied guns, were disassembled into their component parts: barrels, carriages, wheels, ammunition. Each component was then transported by a combination of methods: modified bicycles, reinforced to carry loads of approximately 200 kilograms, pushed and pulled by hand, along jungle paths, human porters carrying components on shoulder poles, and in the steepest sections, ropes and pulley systems to haul pieces up near vertical slopes. The components were then reassembled on the hills overlooking the French valley positions French intelligence had assessed as unreachable by any meaningful artillery force. The scale of the logistics operation, supporting the 56-day siege, was the largest sustained guerrilla logistics achievement documented in modern military history. An estimated 260,000 porters and laborers, many of them civilian volunteers from surrounding villages, supplied the Viet Minh forces throughout the campaign, moving an estimated 100,000 tons of supplies and ammunition through terrain that conventional military logistics would have assessed as unable to support a force of this scale. The specific human cost of this logistics achievement is undercounted in most accounts. Porters worked under conditions of extreme physical exhaustion, malnutrition, and exposure to French air attacks, specifically targeting the supply routes. The bicycle and porter logistics network that supplied Dien Bien Phu is now studied at military academies worldwide as a foundational case study in asymmetric logistics innovation. The Viet Minh assault began on March 13, 1954, with a massive artillery bombardment that immediately demonstrated the catastrophic French miscalculation. The guns the French believed could not reach the surrounding hills opened fire from positions overlooking every part of the French Valley garrison. The strongpoint Beatrice fell within hours on the first night. Gabrielle fell the following day. The French airstrip, the garrison's only resupply and reinforcement link, came under sustained and increasingly accurate artillery fire that progressively reduced its usability, eventually rendering it completely unusable. The French garrison, designed around the assumption of continuous aerial resupply, found itself dependent on parachute drops of supplies and reinforcements that became increasingly hazardous and inadequate as Viet Minh anti-aircraft positions, also transported through the impassable terrain, intensified. The siege's progressive course over 56 days involved a specific Viet Minh tactical methodology. Giap's forces dug extensive trench and tunnel networks that progressively approached French positions, allowing infantry assaults to close the distance under cover, while minimizing exposure to French firepower. The French garrison, despite reinforcements parachuted in throughout the siege, was progressively reduced in defensible territory as strongpoints fell one after another: Anne-Marie, Dominique, Iliane, Huguet. By early May, the French position had been reduced to a small fraction of its original perimeter. The final assault on May 6 and 7, 1954 overwhelmed the remaining French positions. General de Castries and his surviving forces surrendered on May 7. The garrison had held for 56 days against a force that French intelligence had assessed as incapable of mounting the campaign that destroyed it. Paragraph 1 timing, 6:45 a.m. 27:30 am. The specific human cost of Dien Bien Phu did not end with the battle's conclusion on May 7. Approximately 11,000 French Union prisoners were marched, in many cases several hundred kilometers, to prisoner of war camps in conditions of severe malnutrition, inadequate medical treatment for battle wounds, and physical exhaustion from the siege's final weeks. The specific documented mortality rate among these prisoners exceeded 60%, meaning that more French Union soldiers died during and after capture than died in the fighting itself. The forced marches occurred through the same jungle terrain that had defeated French logistics assessments during the siege, terrain now traversed on foot by exhausted, wounded, and malnourished prisoners. The battle's death toll, properly understood, includes this extended mortality among the captured, not merely the combat deaths during the 56 days of fighting. The Viet Minh's own casualties at Dien Bien Phu were substantially higher in absolute numbers than French casualties. Historical estimates suggest Viet Minh combat deaths in the range of 8,000 to 23,000, with the wide range reflecting the difficulty of documentation for a guerrilla force operating without the formal record, keeping infrastructure of a conventional army. The specific Vietnamese willingness to absorb these casualties, fighting a war of attrition against a fortified position, using human wave infantry tactics following artillery preparation, reflects a strategic calculation about the relative value each side placed on the outcome. For France, Dien Bien Phu was a colonial military campaign whose failure, while damaging, did not threaten France's national survival. For Vietnam, the battle was understood as a struggle for national independence in which no casualty level was considered prohibitive. The asymmetry of stakes explains the asymmetry of sacrifice each side was willing to accept. The Dien Bien Phu Valley and the surrounding northwestern Vietnamese highlands are among the most extraordinary and least visited landscapes in Southeast Asia. The valley itself, in contemporary Dien Bien Province, sits at approximately 475 meters elevation, surrounded by mountains rising to over 1,500 meters. With the Nam Yam River running through the valley floor, the same river that French and Vietnamese forces fought across during the siege. The specific terraced rice agriculture that has developed in the valley since the war, the Black Thai and other ethnic minority communities whose traditional villages dot the surrounding hillsides, and the specific extraordinary biodiversity of the limestone karst landscape, characteristic of northwestern Vietnam, combine to make this one of the most visually striking and culturally rich regions in the country, largely unknown outside specialist, historical, and ecological circles. The Dien Bien Phu Victory Museum and the preserved battlefield sites, including the reconstructed command bunkers of both General de Castries and General Giap, and the cemetery containing the remains of Vietnamese soldiers killed in the battle, constitute one of the most significant war memorial complexes in Southeast Asia, though it receives a small fraction of the international visitors that comparable sites in Europe receive. The annual commemoration on May 7th draws Vietnamese visitors from across the country, reflecting the battle's continued centrality to Vietnamese national identity as the foundational military victory of the independence struggle. The specific contrast between the battle's global historical consequence, directly producing the Vietnam War, and its relative international obscurity outside Vietnam and France, is among the most extreme examples of the series' central recognition gap argument. Dien Bien Phu's specific contribution to the decisive battles series completes a developing pattern across 4 episodes. The most consequential battles are decided by preparation and logistics, rather than conventional military superiority. Plassey's conspiracy, Adwa's arms procurement, Tsushima's intelligence and training, Dien Bien Phu's bicycle logistics, and their consequences extend through political and social structures that persist for generations after the fighting ends. The Geneva Accords' temporary division becoming permanent, producing the conditions for American military involvement, is the most direct documented chain of historical causation in the series so far. A specific battle produced a specific peace settlement that produced a specific subsequent war whose consequences are still shaping American politics and Vietnamese-American relations in 2026. The contemporary Vietnamese-American relationship in 2026, including substantial bilateral trade, strategic cooperation regarding China's regional ambitions, and the specific reconciliation processes that have characterized the 50 years since the Vietnam War's conclusion in 1975, represents a specific historical resolution that few observers in 1954 or even 1975 would have predicted. The country whose independence battle indirectly produced America's most divisive 20th century war is now a significant American strategic partner. The specific lesson: the consequences that battles produce are not permanent fixtures of international relations. They can be the foundation for subsequent reconciliation, just as readily as the foundation for subsequent conflict. Dien Bien Phu produced a war. The war eventually produced a peace whose terms nobody at the battle could have anticipated. Dien Bien Phu's specific lesson for the decisive battles series is the demonstration that military intelligence assessments of what is impossible are frequently wrong, and that the gap between assessed impossibility and actual achievement is where decisive military outcomes most often occur. The French were not incompetent in assessing that the hills around Dien Bien Phu were difficult terrain for heavy artillery transport. They were wrong in concluding that difficult meant impossible. The Viet Minh's 260,000 porters and modified bicycles closed that gap. Every battle in this series so far has featured a similar gap between what was assumed and what was actually achieved. The series' developing framework, decisive battles are decided in the space between an assumption of impossibility and someone's specific willingness to attempt it anyway. 260,000 porters, 100,000 tons of supplies, bicycles carrying artillery through terrain assessed as impassable, 56 days, approximately 2,300 French dead in the fighting, more than 60% mortality among the 11,000 captured. The 17th parallel, 500,000 American troops, 58,000 American dead, 1 to 3 million Vietnamese dead. A reconciliation 72 years later that nobody at the battle could have predicted. All of it, one valley, one siege, one 1954. The series continues next episode with the Battle of Angamos in 1879, the naval battle that determined who controls the lithium and copper deposits that the 21st century's energy transition depends on. A war fought over guano and nitrate that produced a territorial settlement still disputed in trade negotiations in 2026. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. The valley is rice fields now. The consequences are still running. The series continues.